All right. So as a quick review from last week, I have set my project. All right, I created a new project, called it class demos, and then I saved my file as component editing. All right, to add primitives, you can either go to the create menu, polygon primitives, and choose your desired shape here, or in the poly modeling shelf, you can choose a selection of the most commonly used primitives. Obviously, this is not as long a list as the menu is. We'll add a couple of objects here. All right, and remember, Q will bring up your selection tool, W will bring up your move tool, E for rotate, and R for scale. Okay, it's the same options here on the side of the viewport. If your manipulator happens to be too large or too small, the plus and minus keys on the keyboard, not the number pad, but on the keyboard, so it's actually the dash and the equals buttons, will increase and decrease the size of your manipulators. Don't hold shift, it's just the keys, plus and minus. You should see this popping up at the bottom of the screen, assuming I remember to turn on show keystrokes in the screen recording. So if that little quirk bugs you, you can modify that accordingly. If you hold down the Option, Alt, or Option button, depending if you're Mac or Windows, and left click and drag, you will orbit your viewport. Middle click and drag, you will pan, and right click and drag, you will zoom. You can also use the scroll wheel to zoom in. Again, this is stuff we covered last week. I'm just going to run through it real quick at the top of this video as a refresher. I do want to mention also your viewing modes. So right now we are viewing our objects in a shaded mode. That's 5 on the number pad. If you press 4, you can see that even the little tooltip popped up there. 4 on the number pad will bring up your wireframe mode, and whichever object you have selected will turn green, so you know which one is selected. All right, 5 is shaded. 6 is textured. We don't have any textures assigned to our object, so it's going to look the same as shaded. And then 7, if you have lights in the scene, you will see the effects, the general effects of lights. It won't be as high quality as if you were to render, but you will see the indication of lights. But for now, we're just going to be going back and forth between 4 and 5. There's also in the viewport menu or toolbar, there's this button here, wireframe on shaded, which will show you exactly what it says, the wireframe laid on top of the shaded object. Okay. And you can deselect that as well. So I'll jump in back and forth. I will try to call out when I'm doing it for the first week or two, but after that I probably will stop saying I'm pressing 4 to go to wireframe. I will assume that by that point you will be comfortable enough with the interface that you'll just know that that's what I'm doing. Next, I want to talk about our channel box here. So we spent a little time here in the channel box layer editor, and if you don't have this visible, it's this button right here. All right, show hide channel box. There also may or may not be a tab on the side of your screen if you want to just collapse it. You can also toggle it with Control A. Will toggle back and forth between your channel box and your attribute editor. Okay. You don't have to remember all those ways, just remember one of those and you'll be fine. So in the channel box, we have our translate, rotate, and scale options. We can also toggle visibility. If you don't want to see an object, you can just set that to off. So if you hit 0, it counts 0 as off and 1 is on. And you can also just type off. I don't know why you would, because 0 is quicker. You can also highlight visibility and right click or middle mouse click and drag in the viewport to the right and it'll turn on. Okay. Again, 3 or 4 different ways to toggle visibility. Like most things in Maya, there's multiple ways to do it. So those are your basic parameters that you can adjust, but there are obviously more. Right up top here is where you name things, and again, please get in the habit of naming them. So last week we were naming the sphere the sun, so let's call it that this time as well. And the cube we'll call a box. I know it's not really descriptive either, but just the exercise of naming and getting in the habit of naming is a good one to have. Up next, I want to move down to this inputs section. And as you modify various primitives and objects, a list will start growing here, showing all of the different actions that you have taken. And you can go back into each previous action and make adjustments, but the earlier you go back, the more likely it is to mess up the object and not do what you initially wanted to. So with the first action, which is the creation of the object, you should make these settings early. And if you need to adjust these things later, I wouldn't do it through the input dialog. If you need to increase the radius, I would actually just select the object and scale it up. It's a more reliable way to do that. But when you create a new object, you have these kind of default parameters that you can define. So we can define the radius. So as I select the radius, and I like to just middle click and drag in the viewport, so you can kind of dynamically adjust it. You can also hold down the control key to fine tune that adjustment, or you can hold down the shift key to make it a more sensitive adjustment and kind of make it work faster. All right, again, let's highlight the text, middle click and drag, hold down shift or control to modify the sensitivity of that click and drag. So you can define the radius. You can also define the subdivisions. We didn't really talk about those last week. Subdivisions is the level of detail in your object. I'm going to go to shaded view. I think it's a little easier to tell what's going on. With a sphere, we have two options, axis and height. So the subdivisions along the axis, as I adjust those, you can see those are the vertical lines running around the sphere. All right, if you go all the way down, the lowest you can go is 3. And then you can go, appears it maxes out at 50. What I would encourage is, as a general rule in 3D, you don't want to have more detail than you need, because you're increasing the how much processing needs to happen when you render. And that might be fine for a still frame, but if you're increasing your rendering time by 10 seconds in a still frame, across a 20-second render, that's 20 seconds times 24 frames a second times 10 seconds per frame, and that adds up, especially if you need to re-render things. So as a general rule with spheres, I like 12 is a pretty good number. Depending on size, I'll even do 8. Even numbers are definitely going to be easier. Occasionally I'll go to 16, and there will be cases when higher would be necessary. Same thing with the height. I tend to keep these numbers similar as a default, but they don't have to be the same. I can say 12 for the height and 16 around. That's fine. And just be aware of these options as you're beginning to build objects, and take a moment to consider how much geometry, how much detail do you need to achieve the effect that you're trying to achieve. So those are the options with a sphere. If we go to the cube and click on the cube's inputs, we've got width, height, and depth. All right, these will adjust accordingly, as expected. Then you also have subdivisions along each of those directions. Okay. So that's adding extra edges, extra vertices, extra faces, which allow you to define more detail. We did look at this a little bit with the torus last week when we did Saturn's ring. All right, where we decrease the section radius a little bit, I believe. and certainly, adjusted the radius. Yeah, and you'll see each primitive will have slightly different options, but will be very similar. It'll be size, subdivisions, and generally it. Okay, so that's the inputs. If you were to go through the Create menu, Polygon Primitives, and look at the actual options, so the little square next to whichever primitive you want to select, that brings up this window. It's a lot of the same controls. You get a little bit more here. But you should also know that when you make adjustments here, let's say we make a width of 2. Click Create. Okay, it creates a cube with a width of 2. And then I make another cube just by clicking on the shelf that has the same dimensions. It doesn't go back to the default 1 by 1 by 1. If you do want to go back to the default, you need to go back into the Create, Polygon, Cube, Options, and edit Reset Settings. And click Apply. And now we've got a default cube again. All right. So just be mindful of that if you do change those settings. That's why it's also a good idea whenever you do open up these options, just first thing, reset the settings. Just so in case you or somebody else that was using, your computer made a change, you don't want that to screw you up. Just make sure you're intentional about it. Moving down the channel box layer editor, we've got our layers panel here. So the way layers work in Maya is kind of similar to Photoshop, in that you can put things on layers, you can hide those layers, you can lock those layers. Obviously, you can name them. You just go to the Layers menu, and you can create an empty layer, or you can create a layer from whatever you have selected. So if I select all of these, I suppose I haven't talked about selection either. You can select multiple objects. Just hold down the Shift key and left click. I think that's a fairly intuitive way to do that. You can also just click and drag across, and it will select multiple objects. Okay. Be aware, however, if I click and drag across here and select all of these cubes, I also selected that torus behind them. Selections go through objects. Okay. I believe you can, if you were to open up your tool settings, so if you double click on it, like the selection tool, I'm gonna pin this to the side here. Okay, you can turn on camera-based selection, and then when you try to do that, it will only select what the camera can see. Okay, so you can toggle that. It's just a kind of a clunky way to do that. But you select multiple objects, you can go to Layers and Create Layer from Selected. You can double click on that layer name. Brings up your Edit Layer dialog. You can name it. So I will name this Boxes. We can color this blue. Okay, by default it is visible. Click Save. Okay, it doesn't change the selection or the highlight of any of the layers. It does in wireframe. Okay, so you can tell what is on what layer here. This V is for visibility, so you can toggle that on and off. I can't remember what this middle one is. Stand by, I will tell you. All right, I think the P is for visible on playback. I think. Yes. Okay, so if I unclick the P and hit play, those boxes are not visible. So let's say, for instance, you had a reference image that you wanted to see when you were working in 3D space, but when you play it back, it just got in the way. You could make that a invisible on playback. And then the third box is for kind of layer mode. So normal mode allows you to select and modify as usual. If you click it once, it turns into a T, and that is for a template layer. So I cannot select, and I can't see it, even though I'm in shaded view. It kind of hides it for the most part. And then if I turn it to R, that's a reference layer. I still can't select it, but it is solid, a solid layer. Okay, so if I was modeling and trying to match proportions or size or scale, I needed to see it in detail but not select it, then you could turn it to a reference layer. We'll deal more with layers as we move on to the temple that we're going to do today. But I want you to be aware that layers are there. You also have these controls here to move a layer up and down the list, create a new layer, and create a new layer and assign the selected objects. Okay. So that's layers. We talked a little bit about grouping objects last week. Okay, to group objects, you just select multiple objects. You can go to Edit Group. Okay, you've got some options with your group too. You can set the center of your new group to the origin, which is the default, and we used that last week as our planet orbit center. Or you can set it to just the center of whatever objects you have grouped. And you can group it under, if they're already parented, the existing parent or the world. Or you can just hit Command G, or I think on Windows it's Control G. You can create a new group. You can see the pivot point is at the origin. Just like that. You'll also notice in the outliner, you now have that group and the cubes under it. Okay. More things I want to cover in this video, then I will pause, create a new video when we get into components. But first, let's talk about duplicating objects. And I know some of you figured this out during the homework. But let's take this cone, for example. If I want to duplicate, let's say I worked really hard on this cone, and it's exactly how I want it to be. And I need more of them, but I don't want to go through all of that work again to make the cone. There's easy ways to deal with that. Do it is just a regular duplication. So edit, duplicate. You can see the shortcut is Command D for those of you like myself that like shortcuts. And now I have 2 cones. 2 cones is better than 1 cone. You can select multiple objects and duplicate them. And now I have 4 cones. 4 cones is, well, it's more than 2 cones anyway. I don't want to assign a value judgment to quantity of cones. But now I have 4 cones. Let's say I want 4 cones in a perfect straight line. Now I could get into this translate menu and say, okay, I want all of them to be translated exactly 4 units on the x-axis. That's not 4, that's 1. There we go. 4, 4. If that's 4, that's already 4. And then I want them evenly spaced. So if this one is at 0 along the y-axis, or excuse me, z-axis, then this one I'm going to put at 2, and then this one I will put at 4, and then this one I will put at 6. Okay, now I have 4 cones neatly arranged, which is great. That certainly works, but that took a little bit of time, and there's a faster way to do that, especially if I wanted to have 15 cones in a line. So here's how I would do that. I'm going to just duplicate this one and create a new row. Now we go to File, or excuse me, not File, Edit. Edit and Duplicate Special. So I'm going to open up the options here. And now we've got some special options. We have Copy or Instance, which I'll get into what that means here in a second. Group Under, Parent World, New Group. Okay, so I can make them all in a new group. And then I've got some Translate, Rotation, and Scale options. I've got Number of Copies. And a few other options that we really don't need to worry about. So let's say I want 15 copies, or 15 total cones. I've already got 1 cone, so I only need 14 copies. It might be a little bit counterintuitive, okay, because you already got 1, but it'll make sense eventually as you start working with the tool. So I want to move them all in a line, and I want to move them in the Z direction, 2 units. So these input windows are laid out X, Y, Z. So I want to translate Z 2 units and click duplicate special. And now I have 15 cones in a perfect straight line. All right, that's the really basic initial level of duplicate special. Now, if I undo that and go back to duplicate special in my options, and this is where making sure you reset your settings between uses is very important. Otherwise, you could potentially get some weird and confusing results. Let's say I wanted to move them so there's a little bit of space between each one. So we'll say 3 units, and I'll do just 9 copies. So we'll have 10 total. And I want to scale them up as they go. So I'm going to scale them up 10% each time. So I'm going to do 1.1 in all fields, so it's an even scale. If I just did it in one direction, if I just did it here, it would just be in the X direction, and it would just get slightly wider each time. But I'm going to scale it up 10% total each time and click duplicate special. And there we go. 3 units each time. Scales up evenly each time. All right. Now it's scaling up from the pivot point of the object. All right. Right now the pivot point of the object is in the center of the cone. Now watch the difference here if first I move that pivot point. Remember, if you hold down the D key, I'm going to turn on snapping here. All right, so now the pivot point is at the bottom of the cone. And now I'm going to do the exact same duplication, duplicate special. Oh, did that go from the center again? Oh, it did. That's okay. Never mind. Ignore me. I was thinking something else was going to happen, but clearly it didn't. So you can modify position, rotation, and scale for each iteration of that object. You could also do something like this, where you've got a cone, and where we did the planet, we group it so that now it's got a pivot point in the center, or instead of that, you could also just move the pivot point to the center. And now we go to duplicate special. I'm going to reset that. We're going to do 11, and we'll rotate along the y-axis 30 degrees. And click duplicate special. And now we have 12 cones in a perfect circle. So if we were doing maybe rivets around a cylinder, or in this case maybe like a clock or Stonehenge, anything like that, that becomes very useful. All right, so that's just copying these as copies. But we can also duplicate them as instances. And when you duplicate something as an instance, its shape, its form is still linked to the original version. All right, so I'm going to undo, I'm going to undo that. Now I'm going to go back to duplicate special and choose instance. Click duplicate special. All right, everything looks the same. But now if I go back to my original and, oops, that's not what I wanted. Let's say I want to make these a slightly different shape. First clue is that when I select the vertex on one cone, that top vertex is selected on all the cones. Now I move this down, and they all adjust. Okay, which means if I make something and then I make a lot of copies of it, I'm not tied to that form. I can go back and modify without having to delete everything, go back to the original, and then reduplicate. I can just make the change, and it's immediately propagated across.
Can you show me do that again? You did duplicate special.
The last thing that I want to cover, I'm going to delete some of these because this is getting slightly out of hand. just everything here go away. All right, those can go too. The last thing that I want to cover is duplicate with transform. And what this is, you can see the key command is Shift D. And what that does is if I take the sphere and I duplicate it and move it and then hit Shift D, it's going to repeat that transform. So if I don't know exactly how many I need, I just need to fill a space. I can just keep going until I hit the right length that I need. And now I've got, I don't know, 30 some odd spheres in a row. And that works not just with transform. You can also duplicate. Let's scale it in this direction. I can't remember if I can do 2 transforms at once. And then Shift D. I can, yes. Okay, so now each option or each subsequent duplication is rotating and scaling and getting really weird. But if I was going for something like this, then that's a great way to do it. But like I said, that's kind of weird. We'll undo that. So I'm going to stop the video here. I will export this, and then we're going to get into editing components.